title this Living Purim and the storytelling of the Belzer Rebbe. So first of all, I want to just give a little background. My wife is actually a descendant, great-grandchild of the specific Belzer Rebbe we're referring to. That would be Reb Shalom Rokeach Belz, the first of the Belzer Rebbes. So when he later wrote a sefer called Sar Shalom, the Master of Peace. His name was Shalom Rokeach, and he is known afterwards among the Belzer Rebbes as the Sar Shalom of Belz. When he was a teenager, before anyone knew he was famous, there's a few interesting stories. I guess I'll give, once we're talking about the Belzer Rebbe, I'll just give another interesting story. Somebody had told the Belzer Rebbe when he was young that if he stayed up and learned 1,000 nights straight, he learned the whole night, he would merit to see Eliyahu Hanavi. So he got together a group of, it's a very interesting story. He got together a group of two guys together with himself, and they decided they're gonna attempt this. This is when he was very young. Obviously, you have to be young to be able to stay up for 1,000 nights straight. Obviously, this is Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, all the Yom Tov. It's 3 years, almost 3 years. He learned. He stayed up to learn every single night for 1,000 nights straight. Extremely difficult.
24 hours a day.
So he slept at some point during the day.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. Or maybe he slept twice even during the day.
Yeah.
So he stayed up for 1,000 nights straight. He had two partners. One of them dropped out after a year, and the other one dropped out after about 2.5 years, almost at the end. And finally, on night 1,000, the Belzer tradition goes that an old man came in. It was Eliyahu Hanavi, and they studied together Torah. And what did they study? Eliyahu Hanavi taught him how to build a shul. And when he later became a Rebbe and they built a shul in Belz, they built the shul according to the wisdom that Eliyahu Hanavi had taught him that night, the 1,000th night he was up in a row. When a lot of the Belzer Chassidim were murdered in the Holocaust, and when the current Belzer Rebbe decided to rebuild the Belzer Beis Medrash in Jerusalem, he had a team of architects go down to the original Belzer Beis Medrash in Europe. They found the Beis Medrash, they found the artifacts, the pictures of how it was built, and he used the same architectural design of the Belzer Beis Medrash in Europe was used to build the Belzer Beis Medrash today in Jerusalem. If anyone's ever been to Jerusalem, when you come in on the highway, depending on which highway you're coming in, but you could see it sort of protrudes right out of a hill. So it's on a hill slope, and it just sticks right out. The joke they say is that, I don't know if it's a true story, maybe it's a true story, I don't know if it's true or it's a joke. So Bill Clinton visited Israel in 1999, I believe, something like that, and he had a helicopter take him from the airport to Jerusalem. So he's flying in on his Marine One and his helicopter, and he sees this gorgeous building. Belz was under construction at the time, but the facade was complete. So he as he's approaching Jerusalem, he sees this beautiful building just popping right out of a hill. It's a very large building, and it's majestic. It's a gorgeous building. I lived right around there. You can look on it online. You can see it's a beautiful building. So he turns to the guy next to him and says, "Is that the Knesset?" Anyway, no, it's not. The Knesset is not as nice architecturally as the Belzer Beis Medrash. Anyway, getting back to the story. Okay, so the Reb Shalom Rokeach, later the first Belzer Rebbe, my grandfather, my wife's grandfather, and ancestor. He was a young teenager. He was about 15, 18 years old at the time. He was traveling through Lublin for Purim. And the Rebbe of Lublin, the famous Chayza of Lublin, the seer of Lublin, was looking around for somebody to choose to lay the Megillah, to read the Megillah for the congregation. And the Chayza is a Rebbe, but the Chayza had eyes. They call him the seer of Lublin. He was able to see. Chayza means to see through. And he was known for being able to perceive very deeply into people. So he was looking through the crowd, and he's not sure who should read the Megillah. And there's a lot of people there, and he's looking and looking and looking. He can't figure it out. And finally, his eyes meet the Belzer Rebbe. Well, at that point, he was 16 years old, 15 years old, young. And he turns to him and he says, "Shalom, you come and read the Megillah." So young Shalom Rokeach, he gets up and he reads the Megillah for the entire congregation. The Chayz is a Rebbe, Siddish Rebbe, and he's shaking and he's dancing and he's jumping, and he's clearly living the story. He's clearly enjoying and relishing and experiencing every moment of the story. So the Chassidim afterwards, they're like, this is an interesting sort of rite of passage for the Rebbe, and it's like, what's going on? So they asked the Rebbe, they said, what's happening? Why did you choose him? And what were you like? What was this such an amazing? Why was this Kriyas Megillah better than any other Kriyas Megillah that you've heard? What was so unique about this young child's Megillah reading? So the Chayza says, as you should know, he says, I never heard somebody tell a good story like this person, this young Shalom Rokeach, who would later become the first of the Belzer Rebbe's. Obviously, this is what exactly does that mean? The big Rebbe likes to hear a story, as if he's a kid listening to a story, and he's so captivated and enraptured by the story. What exactly does that mean? What was the message of the Chayza? Okay, so it's a cool story, and okay, we all heard the story tens, if not hundreds of times. What was so enrapturing? Why was it so important for the Rebbe to have such a unbelievable story time? Try to bring together a few more points. We try to introduce some more questions before we get to the point. Esther, the Gemara says, if you read the end of the Megillah, it says that Esther asked that the story of the Megillah, the story of Purim, be written down into an Igeris. The Megillah is called an Igeris, a letter. Very interesting. As a matter of fact, if anyone's noticed, when we read the Megillah, the Ashkenazi custom is that the Megillah is rolled out completely and it's folded over itself. So God willing, I'll be reading the Megillah in Kessler, and you can see, my Megillah is usually made out of 4 different folios that are stitched together. So I do 2 and 2 and pour one, put them on top of each other. So you have each fold is like a stack of 4 folios. If you're Sephardic, the custom is that the Megillah scroll is attached to a pin, a rod. So that's how it's sort of a letter. It's as if it has that handle on it, and that's considered a letter. So you roll it out, you roll it off the handle. They don't fold it over like Ashkenazim do. But regardless, it's read in letter form. Some way we have to attribute a letter status to it. What exactly does that mean? What is unique about the Megillah that is considered a letter? Another interesting point, the Gemara says that Esther is the last of the miracles. The Gemara explains that if you look through the canon of Tanakh, the last book to be canonized with a story of a miracle is the book of Esther. There are some books that were written later on, such as Divrayim, Ezra, Nehemiah, that they were written after Esther, but they're sort of prophecies as opposed to a canonized miracle story. And of course, the question is, what's the significance of that? What is the significance of being the last in the canon? It's not really the last of the canon, it's the last miracle story of the canon. It's interesting that there's a halacha, if somebody reads the Megillah backwards, so you read the last pasuk and then the pasuk beforehand, and then you read the whole Megillah backwards, you don't fulfill your obligation. Now, this is not such an uncommon law. As a matter of fact, if someone reads Kriya Shema backwards, he also does not fulfill his obligation. But the Baal Shem Tov has a very interesting point. He teaches as follows. He says, what does it mean to read the Megillah backwards? Hakaras HaMegillah Mafrez, someone who reads the Megillah backwards. It means somebody who thinks the Megillah is a story that happened in the past. Says the Baal Shem Tov, the idea of the Megillah Esther, what's unique about the Megillah, is that it's a story that we live and we experience. It's not just a story that happened way back when, and we're sort of recalling the miracle, much like we do with Hanukkah. Megillah, the story of Purim, is a story that we live. It's a story that we experience. We take the lessons of the Megillah and we find them in our own lives. And that's the explanation of the Chayz of Lublin. The Chayz was looking to hear the story. He wanted to hear how every aspect of the Megillah, every emotional change, every transition, every event that happens, it's not just something that happened way back when. It's not a story that happened limafreya back in the day, but it's a story that we live every single year. It's interesting is that when we spoke last week about the building of the temple, and we find in the building of the temple, there's the kruvim, the cherubs that are on top of the Aron Habris, the Ark of the Covenant. And the cherubs have this unique relationship. They are male and female, two children, and their relationship to each other mirrors the relationship of God and his people. So when the Jewish people and God were sort of harmoniously together, they were following the proper way, then they would embrace each other. And when the Jewish people turned away from God, such as in the period toward the end of the before the destruction of the temple, obviously the people were very distant from God. They worshiped idols, there was adultery, murder. So then they would turn away from each other. They would look in opposite directions. But Talmud relates that when the temple was destroyed, so the destroyers, the Gentiles came in, they ransacked the temple, they went right inside, and they found these cherubs. It's not clear if these were the cherubs that were on top of the Ark of the Covenant, or these were sort of on a wall. They were a decor. It's sort of complicated, but regardless, the cherubs were locked in an embrace. And the question is, hold on a second, the temple is being destroyed. Why are they embracing each other? If this is supposed to reflect the relationship between God and his people, if God is destroying the temple, so why are the cherubs embracing each other? It's sort of an odd thing. There's a number of different interpretations. The simple version is sort of that, couples can get into a fight, but compared to anybody else, when somebody else is looking inside, they'll pause their fight for a moment and they'll at least make believe that they're embracing each other. But the Bnei Yissaschar, another Chassidish Rebbe who my great grandfather, he explains that the halacha is that if a man is going on a business trip on a long journey, he has to be together with his wife before he leaves. He, so to speak, can't forget about her. And therefore, the message over here that God was giving was that once the temple is destroyed, so to speak, God is going on a long journey. We feel very distant from him. We feel like sort of the place where the place we spoke about last week, where we were able to relate to him, is gone. Sort of there's no focal point to the relationship. And therefore, it was appropriate for God to let us know before he took the journey that we're still together. And in many ways, this is what's going on in Purim. Purim is the last of the written miracles. And the message of Purim is a letter. It's sort of a love letter. What is a letter? A letter is, I went away to Israel for a couple of days. I wrote my wife a letter, So probably one of those rare breeds that still actually writes today. I don't know what that is. Okay, but I'm the youngest here, so everyone else knows what it means to write. Okay, but in a certain sense, what is a letter? A letter is, first of all, it's a notice that we're cognizant of each other. We know about each other. A letter is sort of indicates that their relationship is long lasting and traverses through space and time. That even though we might be distant, but we're still connected. And therefore, the Igeris of Purim, the letter of Purim, the story of Purim is a letter through the generations. And that's why it's so important to relive the story of Purim. Purim is not just an event that happens. It's not, the message of Purim is not something that happened back in the day. The message of Purim is that Purim is a letter. It's a letter that we constantly reread. I'm told it's not uncommon that, people keep, when people write, letters to each other, they're often kept for a very long time. It's not something you throw out. And that's the letter of Purim. The letter of the Megillah is exactly that. It's a letter that we read and we reread it. And every time we read it, we find something new. There was a story. One of my teachers, he had a student that he grew up religious, but he had some difficulty with religion. He still believed, but he didn't like practicing. He wasn't committed. He was committed, but then he had abandoned his commitments. And at some point, he told one of my teachers, he says, maybe one day I'll come back and I'll get back to my commitments. This is the one thing I can't do. I can't pray. Every day you read the same 18 blessings 3 times a day. It's just boring. So my teacher says to him, he says, I don't read the same thing every day. Every day it's different. It's like, what do you mean every day? The halacha is you have to read the same stuff every day. He says, no. He says, every day it's a different letter. Every day it's a different davening. The message of Purim is that it's a letter. Every time we read it, we find something in our lives, the message of the Megillah in our lives that we can relate to. And that's how Purim is the letter that carries through the generations. It's a story that the Chayza from Lublin celebrated every single year. So go through a few different ideas in the Megillah. What are the ones that we can relate to? So obviously, there's a number of crucial messages. You have the idea of Esther, and this is something most of us can relate to. You have Esther comes into the king. So Haman decrees all the Jewish people are going to be killed, right? The Jews start praying, and Esther decides to go into the king Achashverosh and ask him to annul the decree. And Midrash teaches that before Esther walked into Achashverosh, she said a certain prayer. That prayer was Psalm 23 in Psalms, even though David lived well before Esther, right? A good few hundred years, but he wrote down a psalm. King David lived way before Esther. King David lived before the first temple was built, and Esther lived after the first temple was destroyed. It's at least 500 years in between them. Or not, I should say at least 500. It's probably close to 450 years between David and Esther. David lived 450 years before Esther. There's something around then. So it's taught that he sort of he wrote down a prayer, and this was the prayer that Esther ended up praying. She had a record. The Psalms at that point were available, and this is the prayer she gave. And when she walked in, she said, "Keli, Keli, lama azaftani." God, why have you abandoned us? And again, the message through our lives is sometimes in our lives, we find the story of Purim. We feel like all the decrees are out against us, and we don't feel God is with us. So, the other part of that is that, Purim, we have the story where the Jewish people have this decree against them, they will all be annihilated. But what happens before the decree is written? The steps for the decree to be annulled have already been taken. So before Haman comes to power, Esther is already in the palace, right? Esther, nobody knows that Esther's Jewish, but Esther's already in the palace as the queen, even before Haman gets to power. And when does this happen? At the moment when the Jewish people sin. Achashverosh has a party that's filled with promiscuity. Besides for, sort of celebrating the fact that the temple will never be rebuilt. It's as a side point, but it's a very promiscuous party, as many parties were back in the day. And the Jewish people, unfortunately, attended. And because of that, they did not follow the advice of their leaders. They went to the party anyway. And because of that, that was one of the causes for this decree to be written out against them. And at that same party that they sinned at, which would later cause a decree of annihilation against them, at that same party is when Vashti rebels against Achashverosh and loses her head. And who takes Vashti's place? Esther. So it's right over there, deep in the darkness of the story, sort of at the moment when the Jewish people sin and are worthy to be annihilated for their sins. It's exactly in that moment where the salvation begins. The birth of the salvation is always in the depth of the darkness, where it seems like it can't get any brighter. There's already been a pathway of light created. And as we work through the year and through time, when we listen to the Megillah, these are messages we have to live with. We have to relate to in the Megillah. This is what the Chayza was celebrating when he heard the Belzer Rebbe read the Megillah. He was experiencing in his own life all the feelings he felt toward God. He was reliving them in this book, in this letter that lasts through the ages. I want to end with an interesting story. It's a good way of encapsulating Purim. There were two friends that hadn't seen each other for many, many, many years. They had lost each other for a very long time. And it happened one day, one of them was traveling for business, and he meets the other one in a train station. Taking a long distance train car, long distance rail journey, and he sees his friend in the station. So he gets out of the rail car, he starts talking to him. Now they have a half-hour stop. There's only a half hour to talk. He sits down with his friend, they're talking and talking, they're having a great time, they're remembering all the memories of way back when. And finally, they realized it's 5 minutes left. The train's going to be leaving in 5 minutes, but they didn't finish their conversation. So one of the friends has a good idea. He runs to the counter. He quickly buys a couple of bottles of liquor. He goes to the conductor. He pours him a couple of shots. Conductor takes a few toasts, and before you know it, the train's delayed for an hour. And they have another hour, and they sit down and they finish their conversation. Says Rav Hutner, this is the story of Purim. Purim is when we meet Hashem. We meet Hashem. We understand that everything that happens in our lives, it's really Hashem that's taking us through all of it. But there's only a short amount of time. It's only a short amount of time. And sometimes, our minds want to just move on with things. So you have to take a few sips, take a few l'chaims, inebriate the mind so you can spend time and appreciate where God is in our lives throughout the year and throughout time, and through the lens of the Megillah, of the letter of Purim. Happy Shabbos and have a happy Purim.